Nigeria's economic trajectory in 2024 has been a complex interplay of challenges and opportunities. While the government has implemented reforms aimed at stimulating growth, several factors continue to hinder progress. Reforms such as subsidy removal, tax policy changes indicate a government intent on resetting the economic structure. Yet, questions linger on their impact on living standards and business operations. Key sectors like energy, agriculture, and technology hold opportunities, but success hinges on effective governance and private sector partnerships. Is Nigeria turning a corner or merely navigating another curve? Well, to answer this and other questions is Basil Abia, co-founder, Veriv Africa. Thank you, Basil, for joining me today.
Thank you, Petra. Absolute pleasure to be on New Central again.
Sure. Always a pleasure to have you. Now, my ultimate question to you today is if Nigeria is on the right path with guaranteed economic recovery or at a critical juncture where the future trajectory is unclear. But I would rather we make this a journey of data and numbers. So looking at the nation's broad economic goals, whether it is the GDP, which is projected to be $1 trillion in 8 years, or the annual growth rate of 7%, do you see any form of policy alignment that is geared towards achieving this?
I think it's too early to call, Petra. The reason is if you look at the key indicators, especially the key indicators that should be able to highlight where we're going to as an economy. I'm looking at, for instance, the performance of the Naira against the dollar on NAFEM. And there's some semblance of volatility that's happened in the last 2 months. I know that people will keep mentioning FM as a structure that basically reduces the noise and allows for, actual market level performance of the exchange rate. And we have seen some stabilization in that regard. But again, I do not think that that's the reason why the Naira is going to rebound and continue to rebound. The Naira is going to rebound when actual productive factors come into play. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the largest form of FX inflow for Nigeria is still oil exports, right? 70 to 74% of our FX inflow comes from our oil exports, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And since that's not going to change anytime soon, we need to be able to pump as much oil as possible to support the strengthening of the Naira, the rebound of the Naira. And we're not seeing that happening anytime soon. In fact, there's a potential that the Trump presidency pumping more oil will reduce the global oil prices. And that's going to, of course, have damning effects for the Naira. Now we come into other key indicators like inflation. Inflation is still double digit. Inflation is 33%. It's going to end up being 33% for the year 2024. There are projections. Our projections from Veriv Africa, for instance, is that at worst case scenario, inflation rate is going to be at 38% for next year. And then at best case scenario,
can you take that again? Did you say 38 or 30?
38%, yes. That's okay. The worst case scenario projections for inflation, headline inflation in Nigeria for 2025. But best case scenario, let's say we have all conditions right. Let's say we are pumping oil and selling. We're pumping oil at 1.8 million barrels per day at the very, base level line. And then we're also selling oil at $90 per barrel or higher than that. Those are the, core indicators we should look out for. If Nigeria gets that, then there's a very high chance using our regression analysis, using our econometric model, because we use the vector autoregressive model, for our analytical model, and that deployment gave us the numbers. And for us, at best case scenario, we think that the inflation rate will be 31% at best case scenario for 2025. Now, for GDP, just looking at first quarter for 2025, best case scenario, we're going to have a GDP growth rate of 3.18%. Base case scenario, we're going to have a GDP growth rate of 3.1%. And then worst case scenario, we're going to have a GDP growth rate of about 2.55%. These are all of projections or outlook for 2025, at least from the first quarter, and we worked on this over 3 months, used all of the existing numbers that we got for. I would say this, it's still too early to call. You have to be able to give it some time. As you do know, most policy transmission lags take as much as a year or 2 years. For Nigeria, for instance, it's about 2 years and a month for you to be able to see a policy transmission taking effect when it comes to monetary policy rate hikes. And we've had monetary policy rate hikes, sustained monetary policy rate hikes for just about 1 year since the CBN had a new leadership and decided that MPR hikes were the next steps to take. So using that logic, we still think that we're not going to be able to analyze fully the scope of whether these reforms have been effective or not until the next 10 months. That will give us something close to 2 years, which is, of course, the policy transmission effect lag when it comes to MPR hikes. So there are a number of things. Using just the numbers, it's too early to call, but then using the numbers when it comes to consumers or individuals or the masses, for instance, we know that the price shocks have been immense. They've been vast. We know that a vast majority of Nigerians are currently being affected by these heightened price shocks. We know that that's also transmitting or pipelining into higher rates of extreme poverty and marginal poverty. We also know that this is also affecting the manufacturing base of the economy. We have seen the reports from the Manufacturing Association of Nigeria for 2023, for the year 2023. More than 800 of their members, their member companies have either shut down or, just gone into administration. And a vast majority of them are reporting that they've had to downsize, largely due to energy costs. Let's not forget, because of the liberalization of energy tariffs or energy prices when it comes to price governance, either you're looking at it from the fossil fuel or you're looking at it from the electricity bill tariff system. Because these two price items are now cost reflective or market reflective, they have led to a general spike in their pricing. And we can calculate that. A core of that is being borne by the manufacturing sector. So the manufacturing sector, we do know, of course, from the Manufacturing Association of Nigeria, 40% of their cost of production actually is energy costs. And if energy costs have spiraled by over 1,000% in the last 2 years, that makes common sense that the manufacturing sector are being hard hit due to these liberalization reforms that we're seeing. So from either way you look at it, from the econometrics or just talking to people in the manufacturing sector, talking to individuals, Nigerians, even you as a Nigerian experiencing the Nigerian condition, you know that things have gotten worse. But it's still not enough time or enough sample size to say, to give a verdict on the economic reforms until, of course, we reach that policy transmission lag time for 2 years. So I'm suspecting that the best time to provide an actual evidence-based verdict would be the last quarter of 2025, which would be Q4. So from October, then we can look at the numbers again and then start to give the verdict. I have, of course, my concerns with execution. I have my concerns with how most of the policy reforms were executed. I think that there was a lot of dire work when it came to policy communication. Also, just from the non-tangibles, for instance, the non-tangibles like how the number one Nigerian citizen has been able to play out these reforms, from a public relations lens, for instance. You can't tell, and I'm using a metaphor here, you cannot tell people to tighten their belts when your belly keeps expanding, the circumference around your belly keeps expanding. And this metaphor just explains to me the fact that the establishment, the presidency, has not carried out cost-cutting measures just to transmit to the vast majority of Nigerians that while these are tough times and these reforms are necessary, they are also toughening around their expenses. But we've not seen that toughening of expenses, and that is transmitting another communication to the people. And the people obviously are exasperated. And we saw that transmitted via the End Bad Governance
Mr. Abia, I'm afraid we need to go on a short break now. When we come back, we continue the conversation. What's not transmitting and the one which is transmitting is the one we do not want to be transmitted. All right, when we come back from this break, we continue. Stay with us. Glad to stay with us. And of course, we're still looking at Nigeria's economy, and we're saying, are the reforms working? Well, Basil Abia joins me for more on this. Thank you so much for staying with me, Basil.
Pleasure to be still here, Perpetua.
All right, I will reiterate some of the things you said before we went on that timeout. Just saying that, the best case scenario for you for GDP is 3.18%. And not only that, you also talked about...
the first quarter.
Of course, Q1 2025.
Of the year, yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
And then you also talked about $90 for crude oil. I'm wondering how that is going to work, because even before you said $90, you also talked about some of the indicators that are showing that, the price of crude oil might crash lower than that. But of course, talking about the GDP at 3.18%, I mean, what are the indicators really? What are the, if you're saying this is the best case scenario, what are the things we should see before this, should sort of happen?
Well, best case scenario in the sense that there's some form of stabilization that will come into force. Because if you look at the numbers, we're currently doing 3.22%. We will find out the eventual inflation rate. Well, not inflation rate in that sense, but what I'm trying to say is we'll find out the eventual GDP growth rate for Q4 sometime early next year. So that's when we'll be able to know the Q4 for 2024. But projections from FDC, Financial Derivatives Company, is that we're expecting a 3.22% for Q4 2024. When
Mr. Abia, if you can hear me, I'd like you to just take it up from there, talking about the expectation for the year being 3.22% growth. And of course, Q1. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry about that. So I'm saying that using FDC's Financial Derivatives Company's projections and juxtaposing it with projections from the, not projections, but from actual data from the MBS, as well as a juxtaposition with that of Veriv Africa's, we can say that the best case scenario projections for GDP growth rates for Q1 2025 is actually a slight reduction or a slight decrease from what is expected in Q4 2024. So the analysis from my own end and from that of Veriv Africa's end is that there's some form of reduction in activity, very slight form of reduction in activity. A core of that obviously coming from the services sector, but bolstered by the slight dip in oil prices that is currently happening in the global oil price factors. These factors are very minuscule, by the way, because this we're looking at we're not even looking at percentile, we're looking at sub-percentile numbers, 3.2% and then 3.818%. This is best case scenario. So we're saying that our worst case scenario, if oil prices continue to dive down, if Trump mentions right once he gets sworn in January 6th that he's going to expand exploration and pump more oil, that already will send shockwaves to the global oil markets, and we'll start to see some form of transmission when it comes to the further pumping of oil prices by February and then by March 2025. So by the end of Q1 2025, worst case scenario, we're expecting 2.55% GDP real growth rate, and that will come from that, that assumption that more oil being pumped would reduce the global oil prices to lower than 70%. And if you see global oil prices selling for lower than $70 per barrel, sorry, not 70%, lower than $70 per barrel, then that definitely means we're not going to get a 3% GDP real growth rate or higher than that for the first quarter. That's just the analysis and the underlying assumptions and indicators backing that analysis.
Well, is there any form of diversification that Nigeria can embark on that would sort of maybe mitigate the impact of whatever volatility we're seeing in crude oil?
Diversification will have to come from value chain management. we also have to look at the composition of GDP contributions, first and foremost. We have our numbers. From trade and services, we know that that takes about 60%. We know that agriculture takes about 23%, 25%. So if we look at agriculture, we look at trade and services, we need to be able to make sure that for trade and services, the state of the business environment is drastically improved. And there are only two ways to be able to do that. In fact, for me, I think more production to ensure for diversification in the trade and services sector of the economy is infrastructure, energy perspective, transportation perspective or logistics perspective, a policy governance and implementation perspective, especially when you're looking at the bureaucracies, the red tapes that are affecting or be deadening the business environment in trade and services. And you come back to agriculture, it's the same thing. Infrastructure is the number one hurdle for that comes to value chain entrenchment. A core part, if you analyze the MBS export data, especially the non-oil exports, you see that more than 90% of our non-oil exports are monotonous products. So basically what I mean by this is, for instance, cocoa is our biggest non-oil export. Data posits that. Benny seed or sesame seed, of course, second highest non-oil export. All of these are exported in their base forms or in their second base forms. What I mean by this is, for cocoa, the cocoa beans and then the cocoa paste are the ones that pop out that we export at bulk. We don't export chocolates. We don't have any other additional additives or byproducts of our cocoa products that we're exporting. Just the cocoa beans and the cocoa paste. That's the same for shea butter. That's the same for sesame seed. That's the same for our peppers and our pepper oils that we're exporting. That's the same for all of the spices that we're exporting in their numbers. That's the same for sorghum and soybean. We need to start adding value. We need to see value chain entrenchment. Processing has to come up online, and the only way to be able to do that is if you have an enabling environment for foreign direct investments and local investments to flock in, start establishing processing plants. As I speak to you, shea butter, which is one of our most important non-oil export, we still do not have.
Mr. Abia, I'm afraid this network is really dealing a heavy one on us. But then let's close with this. Looking at the outcome of some of these reforms, on the real economy, we're sort of seeing mixed signals. So talk to us. What do you make of all of this? You've talked about the fact that for you, it's too early for us to call. But I'll just read out some things. We're seeing forex gains and losses. That depends on the industry. For the banking industry, we're seeing gains, while in some other sectors, we're seeing losses. If we take the top 10, listed companies, we're going to see about 7 trillion and all of those things. Now, away from that, we are also seeing fixed income markets being one of the gainers. We're seeing what's happening in the fixed income market. It's driving more people in there. And then when you look at the equities market, it's neither here nor there in terms of whether it's a loser or a winner in all of this. And then apart from that, we have consumer wallets, which is becoming leaner. And then the government is reporting more revenue on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm just reading out this thing so we can put these things in perspective, because you have said it's too early for us to call, but let's look at what we can see right now. So on the one hand, we have the government, saying that it's having more revenue, but then while it's having more revenue, we're also seeing more debt, and we're also seeing more, deficits and all of those things. So how do you tie all of this together?
I think the way to make sense out of the noise and give the accurate signals is to look at what the actual impact for all of these subsectors that you've highlighted. The capital markets have generally, in history, economic history, generally, of course, with the exception of the Wall Street fall and then the global economic crisis that most recently happened between 2008 and 2009, generally, your capital markets are not the indicator of whether an economy is buoyant or not. They, of course, can give you some semblance of, signals as to whether reforms are being carried out. And I think, not that I think, what the data is showing us is the bolstering of the capital markets. The capital markets are becoming bolstered, performing in the bullish numbers. that we have seen in the last 1 year, a core of that is because of the signal that the liberalization reforms of the new President Bola Ahmed Tinubu presidency has demonstrated in the last 12 months. So that is a small signal, minuscule signal. We all know, of course, the core components of the capital markets being bolstered are the big fogays, those the First Bank, Union Bank,
UBA,
Access
actually.
Bank, Zenith Bank, you know what I mean. These banks are furthering in their own consolidation of activity. We're seeing a lot of M&As happening with Access Bank. All of these, there's a transmission back, a signal transmission back into the capital markets that is giving investors, especially local investors, as much confidence as possible. Now, for the FPIs, if you remember vividly, early this year, we had record FPI inflows compared, of course, in context to the very dry last 4 or 5 years that we had of the President Muhammadu Buhari administration. We know that we struggled with FPI inflow over the last 4 or 5 years because of a number of things. But early this year, as a fallback, not as a fallback, but as an indicator of these liberalization reforms, we started to see record FPI inflow, interest of foreign portfolio investors in our equities markets, and in our bonds, a number of subscribed or oversubscribed bonds. Of course, the most recent one that the Debt Management Office just announced with regards to the Euro bond that was just listed, issued by Nigeria. All of these are minuscule but very important signals of the capital markets saying or responding positively to a number of these reforms. But that doesn't really highlight or tell the entire picture, because when you look at the real sector, there's a lot of shrinking in activity. Trade and services, shrinking in activity, record shrinking in activity. In manufacturing, which is the core real sector.
All right, Mr. Abia, we really need to go. We really need to go. We know there is a tax reform bill, which of course is still being debated on all of those. Looking at some of the provisions, do you think it's going to probably encourage growth or production to some extent? Let's close with that.
Yeah, Perpetua, I'll be politically correct and say that the devil is in the detail and in implementation. So we have one devil here, and the devil is going to show its face in detail as well as implementation. We don't implement it properly. If there's still some underlying gray areas that are not clarified, then we're going to see the outcomes. And I end with this very important quote by quite possibly the most quintessential macroeconomist of all time. Milton Friedman has basically said and told us that the best judgment of policy is in its outcomes. So at the end of the day, if the outcomes of these tax reforms are dire, then it means the tax reforms were horrible. That's just the truth. So going back to what Bonaboy tells us that we need to show workings. So it is through the workings that we'll know. I'm
afraid we have to go. We need to show workings, and of course, with time, we'll get to know. I mean, the devil, just like you said, is in the details. Thank you so much, Basil Abia, for your time on the show today.
Thank you so much, Perpetua. Appreciate it.